We're all in government.
I didn't know this was
And then all right, we're gonna get started. I'm doing the introduction. Want to go grab a cookie, please feel free, or you can grab it afterwards. So
Also several gluten-free fruit.
yes, if you gluten-free, there's fruit. I'm Sean T, and I'm one of the co-directors along with Mary Beast of education at Right to Life. And this semester, we've started the Humanae Vitae Commission based off of St. Paul VI encyclical Humanae Vitae, which was specifically against birth control. So we are starting this lecture series off with this one. We'll have three more this semester. One specifically on contraception, one on natural family planning, and then we'll have Abigail Fabali come and give a talk, April 6 or 7, on basically the global effects of contraception and how this led to so much other confusion in society. We wanted to start off with this talk called How Far is Too Far? A Guide to Fruitful and Loving Dating, to offer first, before we get to like the prohibitions, a positive vision of what it means to be both a person, what it means to love another person, and what it means to live in accordance with God's plan and God's love for you. So here we have Professor Tim O'Malley. He is a professor at Notre Dame. He works with McGrath Institute. He was a graduate of Notre Dame, and he teaches probably the biggest second theology class in the theology department called Nuptial Mystery. I highly recommend it. I'll hand it over to him. Professor O'Malley.
Thanks all. It's good to see so many of you. Some of you I recognize from class, except I actually see your face. Some of you I've never actually seen your full face because we taught in Maskland last year. So it's good to see you and to be with you. So I think this talk arose from a comment I made in class once upon a time in Notre Dame when I was an undergrad, in those heady days of 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, when Legends was new and was a place we all went on purpose, not like we had to go to the bathroom there, but we would stop there on purpose. There was often a Theology on Tap series, and of course, the most frequent event wasn't like the doctrine of the Trinity, what does it mean and why does it matter to you, but how far is too far? Which of course was not linked to travel advice, right, for weekend journeys, but how far could I go sexually before it was too far? Now, in some ways, this question, once asked frequently in Theology on Taps when I was an undergrad, is the most conservative question you could imagine asked today. It presumes, for example, that there is a too far, that going there is a complication, that in some sense it's an old-fashioned question. It's linked to a sense that intercourse is reserved to at least a substantial commitment to the person, and therefore, for that reason, there is a too far, at least before one has made something akin to that commitment. So that's I'll go through like 10 theses. That's what I'm gonna do, and then we'll just talk. So, that was my first one. That's a conservative question. That's not one your generation asked in the same sort of way, even amongst the kind of people who show up to a talk called Humanae Vitae. Right? It's a different era, certainly a sort of questions. So, but nonetheless, it actually reveals a goodness. I think when I was an undergrad, we were kind of looking for like some outs, but what if you really love the person? Okay, so the question as it's asked today won't be the same because of hooking up. And I think I've addressed hooking up in other places, and I actually am giving a Theology on Tap, it turns out, next Monday on how to hook up. No, sorry. How to date and not hook up, I should say. But how to hook up, I also have advice on, but not good advice. Okay, so what? There you go. That was the controversial thing I would say. All right. So what's hooking up? I think sometimes, so I've met with like a lot of bishops and other people who are like hooking up. You young people hook up because you're sexually depraved, right? You're like unchaste and you're addicted to physical relationships. I don't think this is true. Having had my off, well, I mean, I think it is partially true, but hooking up in an Augustinian sense, and I did my doctoral work on Augustine Hippo, still allows something like intimacy. You notice in Confessions, Augustine describes all the ways that sins are not entirely sins. They're also goods that are aped of a higher good. It's a disordered intimacy. The disorder is that it reduces intimacy merely to a physical activity, or at least it supposedly does. But the intimacy can't be so easily severed as my office has revealed during the 6 or 7 years I've taught this marriage course, when undergraduates come to me and say, Tim, I'm hooking up, but I actually really like the person. Kind of maybe love them. I don't know what to do. The reality of hooking up, of course, leads to broken hearts. And of course, I assume some people in this room have, in fact, broken hearts. Precisely because we long to be in communion with one another. And the reality of hooking up, of course, right, is that you're doing it because you want to be in communion, but you don't know how entirely. You're awkward. You're very awkward. You're extremely awkward. You can't look other people in the eyes. You walk across quads, gazing at phones, nearly walking into each other. You invented scooters that go 45 miles per hour on the sidewalks. You're not a capable people. So there's really two parts to the question I like to identify. The first is linked to the question of hooking up, right? So how far is too far? Let's deal with hooking up first. It means getting over not communication. How far is too far? It's too far when you hook up, as many undergraduates do today, without knowing, for example, where the person grew up. That's too far. Without knowing how many siblings they have, that's too far, right? It's too far if you do it with drink, a lot of drink. You have to reclaim a culture of intimacy, of communion, where you actually look at each other's eyes and talk to one another, and don't simply communicate via text message. May text one day disappear, amen. It's making a phone call. I know, ooh, terrifying. That's what your parents pay for, really, the phone call. Otherwise, you could, for example, use your phones for using the Wi-Fi networks at Notre Dame. You wouldn't need anything else. Technology, stop using it so much. Drinking, listen, conservative, liberal, there's one truth at Notre Dame, you all drink. And you drink especially when you find it awkward to relate to one another. When I was an undergrad, so many of my very conservative friends hooked up. You know when they hooked up? Drinking, right? Drinking is the mode that allows a relationship to occur, to flow, because you're afraid it's awkward, right? Liquid courage is a term that's frequently employed because it's true. But more importantly, to appreciate the other person, or to appreciate the gift of the other person. That's 3. You've got to end hooking up if you want to really answer this question right. So what's the real question that's being asked when you ask how far is too far? If we survive the problem of hooking up, which I just want to bracket out, the answer is to create a space where we recognize the personhood of the other as gift. It's not how far is too far, that's the wrong question. But what is the good of the other person before me as person? It changes the question. You're no longer operating at a legal speed limit question. How fast can I go before it's too fast? On the Indiana toll roads, around 77. That stage, you'll get caught. Right? It's not that question. That's a silly pants question. It's an immature question. It's a question of a child. It's the question my 9-year-old asks. Right? Like, Dad, how far do I go before I annoy the shit out of you? I look at Chris, it could happen. There, Tommy, that was the right moment. Found it. It's the wrong question. But does my understanding of physical intimacy by which the human person is made for, does my understanding of physical intimacy with the beloved uphold the dignity of their person, their existence as a relational being? So this is point 5. This means premarital sex is out, not just because it's condemned, but because part of our existence is we are fertile. Welcome to a talk about fertility. You are fertile right now. Previous eras, you'd all be having babies right now, or not having babies, but taking care of babies. You're old to my grandparents. You're old to not be producing children. I'm looking at you and I'm like, holy crap, my grandparents had babies at your age. I'm looking at you and you terrify me. Right? Men especially tend to forget this because for the most part, male fertility is not something that is biologically experienced. It's like the single moment men understand their fertility. It's like around the age of 12 and you're like, oh, that thing works. But a woman's fertility is integral to her very biological existence, as all women in this room know, at least once a month. Sexual union, therefore, is ordered toward the act of procreation. There is no better way to have a baby than to have sex. There's actually almost no other way to have a baby than to have sex. And the encounter of trust, of union that takes place makes sense because it makes possible the raising of a child. Listen, friends, having children is really beautiful and exceedingly difficult. Kids are obnoxious, and it takes every aspect of your being as a husband and a wife to not kill them. I think the Lord made children very cute, so we wouldn't murder them. My kid, before we left the hospital with our son, there was a video we watched that was called How Not, it wasn't called this, but whatever, you won't see it. So it was called How Not to Kill Your Baby. It was just basically like when you get home and your child is screaming at you, which your child will, how not to kill them. And I was like, who would kill their baby? I remember I brought my child home the first night, slept the whole time at the hospital. Suddenly I'm holding him, he's crying, and he's crying, he's crying. Now it's 1:30 in the morning. I'm like, oh, now I know. Right? It takes a community of people. It takes both of us. So this intimacy must be guarded. It communicates something with the whole body. I'm all into this relationship, including the consequences of this relationship. I give my whole person into you, and in fact, I do so in an embodied way, which includes the possibility that this sexual act could involve children. That means, this is number 6, the same criteria must be related to any physical act in dating, any quasi-sexual act. Most physical activity that couples engage in while dating can lead to sex. In fact, they're ordered to sex, right? We don't generally put our mouth on other people in general. You're not like at the dining hall, you're like, oh, that's really good. I just, hey, so thanks for swiping my card. Right, that is an image of an intimacy, a desire of sharing, right? To kiss another person is to recognize, like, I want to give part of myself to you. I want to be so close to you. I want to be this close to you. And really, post-COVID, you think about it, it's the most disgusting thing a human being does, right? Like, I have this illness, do you want it? I just, this is where I eat. Do you wanna put your tongue where I eat? Okay, so sorry. But it actually is disturbing, right? As a sort of physical entity, that's actually how we move along. And further, physiologically, like, you're making out with someone. Try not to raise your desire in the midst of that. Right? You're beginning to try to do something else. You want to do something else. In fact, you, who are 18 to 22, your whole desire is to do something else because your bodies are saying, give birth to children. Right? That is what your bodies are telling you to do. My body is saying, go to bed. It's late. So you want to be close to one another, right? This is a good thing. It's a sign of intimacy. And as you grow in spiritual intimacy with your beloved, right? You share a life, you date someone more and more, you'll want to express this most fully of increasingly intimate gestures. You'll want to be closer to one another. You'll want to have sex, right? Partially because it's the fullest expression of your self-gift to the other. And as you learn to love your beloved more and more, that will be the thing you want more and more. But of course, here's the problem. Sex is powerful. It's more powerful than we think. And we can't just rationally always solve the problem. So you might think, okay, how far is too far? In a committed relationship, we're not hooking up. We've loved each other from the beginning of time. So we're fine with this or that act. We can do this for a bit, and then we'll be okay. But remember that this act is ordered towards sex. It's an expression of intimacy. And it's also an occasion at times of profound pleasure for yourself. So I say, the reason why people have sex before marriage is because it's extremely fun. It is deeply fun. Let's just admit that. And this is a strange line, by the way, even in marriage. Yes, sexual activity is pleasurable. But there's an occasion in which both partners could begin to use each other for the sake of this pleasure. It becomes the primary reason for your relationship to the other. This is a problem not because pleasure is bad, but lacking commitment. So here's the thing, like, pleasure isn't bad. But here's the secret that I've often told my undergraduates. Married sex is boring. It happens in the commitment of a relationship. Sometimes it's very beautiful. Sometimes it's the result of an argument that is healed. Sometimes it's just, my gosh, our children are killing us. Right? It's not transcendent. It's not like what you find in any film. It's not like we went into the room and we ripped each other's clothes off because we could not contain the emotion. No, it is often occurring after you fell asleep in one of your children's rooms. You're already asleep. You wake up and you're like, oh man, I promised I'd be with you tonight, but I'm so tired. I'm so tired. Yeah, like what time is it? 11:30. Do this. once in a while, right? Yeah, wanna have a kid? I don't know, maybe, but I'm tired. This is actual sex. By the way, it's a great gift. I'll describe in a moment. I make marriage sound terrible. But the problem is that if you think pleasure is the whole thing, if you lack the commitment, is that the pleasure becomes pursued for its own sake. It's not an expression of deeper intimacy, but a chance to forget the busyness of your life. You do it because you rely on like feeling beloved, right? These are dangers that can occur in anything, in any sort of physical relationship. So what's the real thing? The real thing, and this is point 8, is communication with one another. You need to talk about physical intimacy in the context of the relationship. You can't just let it unfold naturally, right? Like, well, that's awkward, right? How many of us have dated people who were like, I don't know, like, I like you, you like me. But you didn't have a conversation like, whoa, I got boundaries. This is where it is. Hey, have we talked with one another about what we're comfortable with physically? Now, like you gotta talk about that stuff. And the worst time to talk about it is in the middle of it. That is not the proper time for a chat. You're not rational creatures at this moment, right? It's not like, oh, this is my problem, I suppose, with language of consent that's often employed in sort of a university level. It relies upon like, oh, is it okay now? That's too late. It's too late to be having that particular conversation in the middle of this sort of heated exchange, right? Often drunk, to be honest, at least in the hookup culture. So you gotta talk about this stuff. It's okay to talk about it. I remember talking to my wife, I was like, I really do, especially as she wasn't my wife at the time, I should say. I was dating her at Notre Dame. If I was talking to my wife like this would be very weird. But she was my girlfriend at Notre Dame, and I was like, you know, this is hard because like I really do want this with you. And she's like, yeah, me too. And it got worse after we were engaged, to be honest. And then it was like, I really want this. And she's like, yeah, me too. Like we had to talk about this. Like we had to be honest with one another that this was something we desired. So that's what we're talking about. It's communication. And I should say it's not a matter of purity, right? Like I want to, well, purity in a certain mode, but I want to dismiss one notion of purity that exists in all of this, which is like, oh, if you do it, then you're so screwed up that you can never enter into any literal relationship, whatever. My wife worked for the Archdiocese of Boston once upon a time, and there was a terrible like theology of the body curriculum, not because it was theology in the body, it was terrible theology of the body. It wasn't actual theology of the body. And it was this thing where it was like, okay, all the kids were supposed to like take M&Ms in their mouth, you know, spit into a cup. And then the next person spit into a cup, and the next person spit into a cup, and the next person, it was the same cup. And I was like, this is not COVID friendly, certainly. All right, so, and then like the last person held the cup in his or her hand, and it was sort of like, well, this is what it's like if you marry someone who's had sex with lots of people. That's like bullshit. That's terrible, right? That's not a true thing. That's not how human relationships work. That's terrible. And that's not a proper sense of purity, right? You could screw up. You have screwed up. I know, because I did. Not entirely, but I did. It's not, so you can't take that as your understanding of purity. That's not good. It's because of the totality of self-gift that you seek to give to one another. You seek to give your full self. And therefore, an asceticism is required in these relationships. You need to be attentive to physical activity with one another, what it leads to. That being said, this is hard and you will sometimes fail. Many of you are going to fail at this. It's not because you're terrible people. I mean, you are. But it's because it actually is a good that is upheld. It's like these sort of questions have surfaced for ages. Jonathan Edwards, the great Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sort of character in Puritan New England, they had an idea to sort of like, for courtship, like before we betroth couples, we should put them in the same bed together and we'll call it bundling, because we'll tie them up functionally, one side and the other. And it turns out, you know what happened? They unbundled. And they had babies, right? And so, like, we're not the first era to deal with this, and that's okay. Let's acknowledge that things are very complicated, especially though today. You're waiting longer than any other US generation to get married. You're dating for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6+ years. You can't do that forever. You just can't. You'll want to have sex, especially if you've not chosen to pursue celibacy. Now, we can be celibate, right? That's a great gift. It's a recognition of the gift of our sexuality. But if you're dating someone for 6 years and you're not desiring to engage in intercourse with them, I have some questions. Right? I mean, and you're almost engaging, to be frank, in what I would call an almost quasi-superhuman task at that stage. To wait 5, 6, 7 years where you're dating someone and you're very intimate with them with the rest of your existence and the rest of your life, and yet you are not engaging in any sort of intercourse. That's why I think most of you should, if you're in that situation before you're 6, should get married. I think it's too long. If you've been dating someone for 4, 5, 6 years, what are you waiting for? Money? Yes. Don't worry, you won't have it. Right away. Stability? Forget that. That's the stupidest thing that anyone has ever pursued. That's why you should authentically pursue that. And yet, in the midst of this, let's say you can't, there is a task of the development of virtue, akin to what we find in celibacy. It's linked to prayer with one another. It's a relationship experience in the context of friendship and friendships, right? So you're spending time with other people, you're spending time with your friends, you're having a relationship that's not exclusively focused on one another. It's setting boundaries for one another that allow for flourishing. No, not that. The question isn't how far is too far, but what do you do with your time? How often do you spend time alone in situations where crossing the line for you might be possible? But all of this, of course, is dependent upon the gift of God. And that's where we return again to celibacy. No celibate will say, like, I'm celibate through the sheer force of my own will. Right? It's gratuitous. It's grace. If you mess up, good news. There's mercy. The mercy of our Lord. If you don't mess up, it's not because you're stronger than all other people and ought to set yourself up as a paragon of virtue. As the Desert Fathers remind us, as soon as you do so, you've already failed. It's gratuity. That's what chastity is. Chastity isn't willing yourself towards intrinsic good through like pain and suffering. It's receiving gift. And so the last point is that, therefore, for this reason, how far is too far? That question doesn't end when you get married. Marriage isn't a license, therefore, to engage in any sexual act that you want, right? Like, how far was too far? Well, anything before marriage was wrong, but now marriage is like Disney World. Actually, marriage is like Disney World. There's still a concrete person there, someone who is not reducible to the sexual act. That person does not exist for your pleasure. Marriage doesn't mean I can do whatever I want. There's pregnancy, there's periods, there's times of exhaustion, there's mental health, there's life. In that sense, the task, the education into an account of sex grounded more in communion and friendship is really what we're called to than what we see in television or film. And I don't bash television or film. I just watch Only Murders in the Building, and I cannot tell you how delightful that show is. So I'm not like I don't hate culture, but it does propose to us something about the nature of human sexuality that at times is difficult to reconcile, right? We don't see old people have sex in movies. Except, well, no, except nothing. They're beautiful, the passion is there, but it's not that committed existence. It's important to remember that sometimes even our account of married sex, what it will be, is far too impossible for anyone to achieve. So how far is too far? I haven't given you any answers to the question, like, don't do this, no, this is in. Don't worry, you're safe. My question is, do you recognize the person that you're dating in particular? And do you recognize the gift of that personhood enough that you would honor the orientation to which sexual existence is given, which is partially and primarily, or sort of teleologically, I should say, the final end is for the sake of children. And therefore you recognize the gift of what you're given. That's all, and now it's a chance to chat. Great.
Awesome, so yeah, we'll just ask questions now. Raise your hand and I'll call on you.
Or comments, or whatever, do whatever you want to do. It's your
No
life.
criticism.
Criticism is fine, but I'll fight you. The ship. I'm just kidding, I don't have a ship. Steve.
You said married sex is boring. Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, I can, yeah. So it has to be located in the general context of adult life as a whole, which is intrinsically boring. Right, like, it's hard to imagine a world in which, I don't know. Okay, so this is the easiest way to say it. How many of you in this room are 21? Great. You look forward to that occasion. Why? You can be honest. I know the answer to the query.
Is it cheaper to rent a car?
Not that cheaper. That's 25. Okay, so drinking. You go to a bar. Well, not even drink, but you can go out, especially in Indiana, right? Congratulations. Welcome to all those places you couldn't go to without an identification card that was perhaps false. You know what happens after 25? Almost nothing. Right? Life commences. I once gave a talk in Chicago for Theology on Tap. It was, for a while, the most widely attended Theology on Tap in the Archdiocese of Chicago. It was probably on something really sexy. No, it was on what happens when life is disappointing. And it was in Lincoln Park, and there were 375 young adults there. We have built up for you an impossible vision of life, of perpetual progress and growth. That is not what life is. Now, life is amazing, right? It's gratuity, it's gift, but it's not perpetual progress or growth, right? So married sex is boring because marriage is boring. In the best sense of that term, right? It's the relationship you share with the other, right? It's, here I am out tonight. Do you know who's paying the cost of this? My wife, who's putting our kids to bed. Right, I'm here for you because of that. And there are millions of those events that are occurring. Do you know what we talked about today? What time is Tommy's choir rehearsal? Ooh. I had a conversation today, as we said earlier, about Tuesday. And my daughter wore a tutu. We talked about that along the way. Am I interested in that? I am not. I do not care. This is a mere accident of life that you have all these twos together. It's somewhat fascinating. It's not enough for me for a 15-minute conversation. And yet that was my drive to work this morning. Friends, this is virtue, right? It's not this perpetual chasing of exotic life, of transcendent experiences, right? Notre Dame told you a lie and they still tell you a lie, right? You want to chase the Notre Dame experience, collect all the things you can get while you're here. And then they're going to tell you, those of you who are graduating this year, you will be in the stadium and they'll say, only at Notre Dame. And they'll use the weird way they say it. Only at Notre Dame. And now you'll go and the rest of your lives, you'll change the world. No, you won't. I mean, you will, because changing the world is something we do every time we exist, we breathe, we're accidentally changing the world. But you won't always do it. Life is not that. And that's why married sex is boring. Not because it's more boring than other sex, it's because it takes place in the context of the rest of committed existence, which is stable. And for us today, stability is boring because we're used to rapid changes. I mean, you're gonna get to like you will move so many times when you graduate from this institution. You'll be like, when do I move again? When do I move again? And then you're gonna settle into a house, you're gonna be like, oh, I'm not moving again. This is my job. This is my life. Maybe for the next 35 years, God willing, until I retire. And that's why it's boring. But that's also why it's healing, right? Because instability is miserable for our existence. And somehow we've created a sort of unstable environment. So that's what I mean. I don't mean, I still personally love my spouse and we enjoy spending time with one another. But in the context, that's why you invited me. So, but it is part of like, it's not like, you know, it's not like an episode of your average sitcom, if those even exist anymore. Does that make sense?
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. Other thoughts, questions, queries, thoughts? It's kind of awkward, but yeah, go ahead.
How does, you talked about communication, how does that change, so starting like before marriage and like having sex, but then how does that change once you do get married, right? Is it, I mean, obviously you're talking about something else, but does that mean the communication, like the means of communication changes?
So you mean like about sex?
Yeah, or like what is a healthy way of kind of transitioning over to talking about that in marriage when you're not really talking about it beforehand?
Well,
Setting a boundary.
based upon the themes here, natural family planning is actually a great way to do that. It is like early in our marriage, my wife and I couldn't have children biologically, so we haven't used NFP for many years, but we also haven't used anything else for many years. So we stopped using NFP, but NFP was a great sort of occasion, like, oh, so you're fertile. Oh, this is a big deal. And what does that mean? And it's actually sometimes communication about things. I suppose this might be an interesting and sort of awkward moment to sort of discuss about, but it's like, oh, like, beloved, you're in extraordinary pain this evening because you're having cramps that most men didn't know existed until you lived in the same house as the same person. And then you're always like, oh, well, you have a period. I know what a period is. And then you're like, no, it's not. I did not know what a period was. And I did not know actually the cramps that can occur in the midst of, as you sort of shed your uteral sort of lining. And are you uncomfortable with this? I'm not uncomfortable with any of this language. And part of that is natural family planning. And so my wife and I started talking about this, and now we're aware. And so it's all sorts of communications occur. I know when my wife's period is at hand. I know when, therefore, she needs a night where I take the kids, because it always hits in the middle of the night. She can't sleep. And like, this has nothing to do with sex, but this is the kind of communication that actually occurs. And it's part of actually the sort of nuptial occasion by which we're sharing our lives with one another. You, of course, also the other gift of marriage is you develop much more subtle ways of communicating with one another because you've lived in the same house for 20 years. You know when there might be interest in romance. You have subtle ways of communicating. You no longer have to say, like, hey, what do you think about tonight? Like, maybe you're like, oh, it's been a while, I should bring home flowers tonight. And that will open up a little bit of openness to this. And I should, God, I feel like I'm being very intimate right now, but too far. It's too far? It's too far? Okay, yeah. So you develop subtle ways of communication. But this is actually what it is, right? But because you know the person well, the communication becomes more subtle. When you're first dating, you don't know your beloved as well. And so you have to be much more direct. I don't have to be as direct with my wife, right? Like, we're 20 years in and we know each other fairly well. And sometimes my wife is just like, nope, not tonight. I'm like, see you tomorrow. Yeah.
Going back to the dating relationship, you said that all the telos of all physical action is towards sex. So can you give us some ways to understand where you need to stop in terms of, or not even necessarily stop, but what the things you should be thinking about as you're progressing in the relationship, or like, should you not even touch until you get married?
Depends on if you talk to the person's father. No, I'm just kidding. No, of course you're going to touch one another. And there are different sort of like, they're different people. And my general recommendation is that if you really love the person, you will avoid those situations that will most likely lead to sex. You're alone in a single at midnight. Varietals are 2 beautiful hours away. You turn on a movie, you know what can happen. And maybe you're confident in your ability not to. But you might not be confident. Like, you wouldn't be the first person, of course, to be confident and even have sort of certain rigorous positions around sex that then ended up having sex. Again, because it is a delight. So I would say, like, what's comfortable, what's right, what's intelligent, what's the level of commitment in the relationship, who's there, who's around. Like, if I could go back to myself, like, these are things I did. We did not ever engage in intercourse, but these are complications. If you're the kind of person who values this, then you should be attentive to it and you should talk to each other about it. Does that mean you can't hold hands? I hope not, unless you're really a pervert. Okay. Does that mean you can't kiss? No. Does that mean you have to understand what you're committing to? And more importantly, what it's communicating to your beloved. Are you actually all in? Are you all in? Or are you looking for your own companionship? Are you looking to feel something yourself? These are questions you have to ask yourself, and perhaps even in the context of spiritual direction. I don't think it's a bad idea to get a spiritual director if you're dating in a serious relationship, who is also your confessor ideally, because it allows you an occasion to be very honest with yourself. This is where I am, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm working. So I don't have like a, this is the moment where you've crossed the line. Because the line is your recognition of the gift of the other person. And you could cross the line by simply taking them to a dance and showing them off as if they're your special piece, because you want to acknowledge that you want your friends to acknowledge how awesome you are. And you may not even kiss them, but in that sense, you've already reduced their personhood to your own pleasure. And you've actually already entered into a vice equivalent, in my assessment, to the worst sexual sin you could engage in, reducing a person to an object for your own pleasure. And that's the great danger. No big deal. I'm sure you don't do that.
Other questions?
Or thoughts? It's kind of a weird topic. It's like started writing the talk. It's like, this is gonna be awkward.
I have a question. So I've found that around a conversation like this, you can find a lot of disagreement among like good Catholics, like trying to live healthy relationships around the topic of sleeping over. It's like, it's not something that's, it's not like fornication, it's not like intrinsically evil, but like Father Mike Schmitz has a great video on this where he says like it's new occasion of sin, scandal, stuff like that tempts in. So do you have any comments on that?
Well, I mean, so I'm not Father Mike and I'm not a priest. I haven't heard confessions. Roughly 6 days into my formal dating relationship with my beloved, I slept at her house with her parents under the roof. We were fairly not tempted, I should say. I think it depends. I think you have to use wisdom in all this approach. I can see why it's a terrible idea. And I have to admit, if my daughter or my son came to me tomorrow, I was like, they're 9 and 4, so they're not going to. But let's imagine a future world where my son or my daughter is like, I'd like to spend the night. Like, well, actually, in retrospect, my in-laws were stupid. So, okay, so I can see the problems of it, but I mean, like, at a certain stage, if you commit yourself to this, like, there's a lot of things that have to happen. Like, you'd have to sleep in the same bed. You'd have to be in the same room. You'd have to not have your in-laws upstairs. So I don't know, like I'm a little bit more like, sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we're all together and that's just what happened because we travel together, and you should be careful and you should respect one another and be adults. And I don't know, like a near occasion of sin. I don't know. I don't know if there's a way of thinking through it. I think you should be prudent, and prudence requires, like, if you're spending 12 nights out of 13 nights with each other, that's different than like, oh, we're on our way up to Wisconsin and we spent a night together, except there were rules. So I mean, I don't know. I have no universal solution to the problem. My wife was very clear with me. I was clear with her. We talked to one another. We were very clear with boundaries. And we went to the Dells once and we slept in the same hotel room, and we We didn't even go to a water park. It's the most depressing trip in the world. And what we did do was eat at a restaurant and then go visit her family. And she slept in one bed and I slept in the other. And I wouldn't have crossed that boundary because that was a boundary I wasn't willing to cross. But that was me. Maybe Father Mike would say I was wrong. He's stronger. I mean, literally, he's a human being. Anything else? It's fine if you don't. It's been a joy to be with you and see some of you again for the first time in a while, or ever. Abigail will be a great talk. She's a friend of mine. I wrote, yes.
In regards just to like communicating with someone, even in just like friendship, do you think it can be kind of dangerous to know someone so well that you like don't think that you need to communicate as much?
Yes. I think it's good to communicate more than less. Not in a weird way, but in a appropriate way. I think especially in friendship when dating is a possibility, I think that's actually especially the time to communicate well, because there's all sorts of ambiguities. I've heard at Notre Dame that sometimes people are very bad about admitting their feelings towards one another. And so rather than remain ambiguous about this, I think it's important to, as best, communicate, not in an awkward way, but in a real way. I think if we had more of that, people would be dating each other more instead of doing a 2.5-year dance around one another in which they might hopefully get, you're laughing, you covered your face. Nobody knows what's going on and they're wondering what's going on. I don't understand why people, like if you really like someone, I just don't understand why you just don't walk up to them and be like, hey, it's very clear that we might like each other. Our friends say so. My roommate has said so. Would you like to go out on a date with me? Right? Like this sort of communication is awkward for us, but it's better than the current option, which is like, well, maybe, I don't know, something will happen one day where all of this will come to light. So I think, yes, this dearth of communication is such an endemic problem. I think especially among folks in your generation. I'll tell a hilarious story. We once had phones in our room at Notre Dame. Brown phones, with little red lights when you had a message. And we would often communicate our interest in people through these, you could silent message someone. You could call them and their phone wouldn't ring, but when they picked it up, it was like, hey, Kara, that was my wife. This is Tim. I was just thinking about you and I like you a lot. I don't know. Maybe we want to meet up at the dining hall. We did the same things. In fact, we did more of the same things because there was no Eddy Street Commons. There was just a road and the backer. Those were the two things. It wasn't, we did go to the backer a lot later, but when I was below the age of 21, we didn't stand in a road. So, but like this was an occasion of like recognition of like, oh, hey, like this is my voice and this is me trying to communicate with you, not ambiguously, but like in reality. I think that's really difficult for your generation. I'm not blaming you. I blame the tech overlords that gave you everything that allows you to not communicate with one another and not be direct with one another and to be more comfortable saying, sending a text saying like, hey, what's up? Or hey, you awake? I blame that, and so it's good to just talk and be like, hey, I'm feeling it. Not all the time though, right? Because that's also weird. You should be able to talk about like sports and arts and weather. The official topic of South Bend, weather. All right. Anything else?
She's scared.
Are you two dating?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any advice if you have a friend who is not Catholic, doesn't share those values, like navigating that kind of discussion with them if you have been
keyed into, I'm sure, a very appropriate conversation about their intimate life. And, you know, a way to navigate talking with them. about-
They're a good friend.
Yes, a good friend.
Okay, so good.
Also Catholic, but maybe, you know, maybe a little less.
I teach this class, believe me, I read all of your love lives, okay, so. Your friendship is the most important witness to evangelization you bestow. These issues are more existentially fraught than any other issue that you can bring up. Because a variety of people know, for example, that they may have crossed a line that they didn't want to cross the line on. And suddenly being like, well, the church teaches is to be frank, is the literal worst thing to do in that situation, because they're like, I know, now I know that you hate me. I think it takes trust, it takes a communication in which you can share part of yourself that isn't like the kind of brief communication that occurs in a dorm or like in a residence hall where you're like, hey, like I hooked up with this girl last night, like, oh man, that was awesome. Yeah, it was awesome. Did you know what the church teaches in this? Like it takes you being in a situation where you're like, hey, like what happened? Like what happened? And like ask real questions. Like they're your friend, right? So ask real questions like, hey, what happened? Like, are you worried about this? Are you happy? Do you like her? Well, if you do like her, like, wouldn't you want to communicate that to her in a way that was like more direct? Like, don't you think she's wondering right now, like what this means? I don't know, like she liked it. Well, no, did you talk to her? Have you called her? What about flowers? Have you thought about flowers? My answer is flowers for everything. So, but like, I think that kind of questioning opens up horizons where like, listen, almost universally, everyone knows the church is teaching on this. It's not like anyone's like, oh, I had no idea. I didn't know that. Oh, I thought it was like in bounds, right? Like, especially if they're Catholic, they know it, but they're awkward about it, and they're angst-ridden, and they're probably guilty, as at least I'm Irish Catholic, so I always presume guilt. Like a modicum of guilt. So I think like ask questions. What do you really want? What do you really want out of a relationship? Like, don't you want to fall in love? Like, don't you want to be with someone for the long term? What does that mean for you to be in a relationship with someone for the long term? Like, do you want this person to be your wife? That's a great question to ask all the time, I should say. The more we ask each other, do you really want to marry this person? The better. We should just start talking about that, not in a weird way. Like my undergrads in the marriage class are like, everybody in Notre Dame is like ring by spring. Let me tell you something. None of you are ring by spring as a whole in toto. One or two here or there. But there's this narrative that you're all getting married at the age of like 21. You're not. Your average age of marriage at the University of Notre Dame, if you're Catholic, is 26 years of age. 27 today. That's how old you are as a whole. Right? So start asking them, hey, do you want to get married to this person? Would you marry them? Not right now, but thinking about marrying them? That's an awkward moment, but it changes the dynamics of the discourse. Rather than like, hey, yeah, like I didn't mean it, but it just happened. Or like, yeah, we're having sex, we just don't know what it means yet. Like, you want to marry them? That's okay, you can ask that question. So I think questions, friendship is everything, but it has to be in the context of friendship. I always say like go out for coffee, take a guy's weekend in this case, or girls' weekend, since I'm not sure who the question is asked for in this instance. Where you like have an environment where it's safe to talk about these things apart from here, right? Go to another place, rent a cabin in South Haven, and hang out for a weekend. That's my recommendation. It's friendship. And then recognize that all this is gonna happen and 15 years from now, everyone might be fine. Right? Like, remember that everyone might have kids and be fine and having distinctive conversations. We're all on this sort of pilgrimage and journey together. And some of us have arrived at certain positions earlier than others. And you're all going to probably be fine. I say probably because some of you probably won't. No, I'm just kidding. But you'll probably all be fine in the end, right? This is hard stuff you're dealing with, but go away, talk to one another, be friends with one another. I was in the Glee Club, all sorts of weird stuff happened in the Glee Club. Now we're all super boring. Here we are in our, there you go, yeah. You're gonna be really boring one day. So, here we are in our 40s and we're like, hey, so, what are we doing? What's your investment situation like? And that's where we are, so. All right, everyone, thanks.
You should have got a cookie if you want another on the way out, if there's any left. And check your emails for the next Humanae Vitae talk after spring break.
There will be no fruit, to clarify.
Also, we recorded tonight. I'll put my email on the board. If you want to email me, I can send it to you if you want to just go send it to someone.